I think by definition, we live our own lives and we think, well, this is normal because it's my norm. And people, may not recognize like your life is really interesting, even if it feels like I'm doing my own thing. It doesn't, I've never gone to space. I've never, cured cancer. Well, every single one of us does have a story of how we got here.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. As of today, according to Spotify, the show is now heard in 69 countries. That's why I call this the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest today is Piper Hendricks, the founder and CEO of Stories Change Power. Hello, Piper, and thank you for being here today.
Hey, Melvin. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I met Piper earlier this year at the Principal's First Summit in Washington, D.C., and we chatted about the work she does. So from what I heard from doing some research, you fear confrontation a lot. So how did you get involved? How did you get involved in advocacy communication?
My goodness, that you have definitely done your homework. And yes, I don't like confrontation personally. What I learned, including in law school, is if I'm standing up for somebody else, then you can't stop me, especially, someone in my family, someone I care about. Like I can become a bit of a bulldog. But for myself, I'm a bit more of, gosh, I don't want to say doormat, but I definitely, and I think that comes from, I actually, I, I say it with a smile, but I think it's genuinely a good thing in the sense of wanting to listen to all sides of things. And then, I do still have, principles, and like as the name suggests from the summit that we met at. But I think I'm more, maybe open-minded and less quick to have, to any sort of confrontation if it's not on behalf of somebody else.
That's kind of funny because I'm much the same way. I think every fight I've ever had, and I haven't had a fight since probably like junior high or something, but every fight I've ever had has been defending somebody else. I've never had a fight because somebody picked on me or I picked on somebody else. It's just in defense of somebody else. So maybe it's a Texas thing. Both of us being from Texas.
I wonder, and I genuinely, I think if we're not, when we're quick to anger, then we might miss a lot. I think having a step in there just to confirm, like, are you meaning to insult me right now? Are you meaning to be, or, oh, maybe it's a misunderstanding. Having that space to learn is a good thing. But then if you confirm that somebody actually is, being awfully rude to you, then
Then it's on.
having a spine is yeah. There we go.
All right. So can you tell my listeners how stories change power?
Oh gosh, yes. So I think about, I'll take the words apart and then we can put them back together. But when I think of stories, and thankfully it's a word that people use a lot more now. I think we pay attention to stories beyond children's books and bedtime stories. It's the bigger stories in the sense of how do we see the world? What's the story that we're hearing about the way the world operates, and then also the stories we're telling ourselves. And is that something where you tell yourself, to keep what we're talking about with whether we stand up for ourselves or not? Am I worth, standing up for? Am I, do I see this person as somebody who's attacking me? Or do I see them as somebody I'm trying to understand? All of that under the umbrella of stories. And then when we think of change, and that's a word I know, generally as humans, we don't like it. We want things to stay the same. We want them to be, maybe not stay the same, but at least be a little bit more predictable. But change happens whether we want it to or not. We were just talking about the weather in Texas, and that'll change, in an hour. But we've also got the seasons. We've got a lifetime of change. We've got things that for better or worse, change is part of our lives. And then when we think about power, I think about that both, again, that as our individual power, and then the power more broadly when we're in kindergarten. The people with the power are the principals. As we get older, the people with the power quite often are, you've got elected officials, you've got people, you've got your boss. What is that power that is outside of us, and then what's the power within us? And so when we put all those words together, thinking about the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories, the way we see the world, how we can change that power, including who is elected, and also including how we think of ourselves and the way we can impact the world. So there's a lot that we pack into those three words.
Okay. So, as a Texas native, what kind of lessons do you think you learned that were unique to your environment?
Mm, I think a couple things come to mind. I grew up in a small town of Temple, and that was a good place to grow up at the time, in the sense that there was enough to do that you weren't bored, maybe not so much that you could get into trouble. Although I think about that, and there are some friends who could still find some trouble. But I think that growing up there and seeing different, I grew up mostly in a predominantly Christian town, different denominations, but that was a big formative part of my life, which is now top of mind again. I've been reading a book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and looking to understand more about the role of the church, the difference between religion and faith. And so I think growing up in Texas, seeing a lot of people who were religious, who lived their faith, who some just profess their faith, but maybe didn't live it. Those really shaped, that perspective shaped where I am today. Does that make
Dietrich,
sense?
yeah, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's not from Texas, but you learned the lesson in Texas. He happens to be my hero too. He's one of my three heroes. I would count him as
Ah,
one of my big three. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., and my dad. I consider my three greatest heroes.
amazing. Amazing. Yeah. I found a book on my dad's shelf and started reading it, and I'm really grateful to have done. Yeah.
Yeah, really inspiring character. So after you left Texas, you went to Vanderbilt in Tennessee, and then Michigan for law
Mhm.
school. Now you consider yourself a recovering attorney, and you're a storyteller. I want you to tell me a story about the American ideal of the rule of law. What does that look like now? And what do you think it's supposed to look like?
So it's a fascinating question, because even though I went to law school, I didn't really start thinking about rule of law as that phrase until I was working in Costa Rica. And that, I mean, that says a lot, having literally graduated from law school. But I think what it says to me is that the rule of law is something that's so baked into our way of living that we don't even talk about the phrase that much in the United States. And and so then thinking about it more outside of the US, I saw that because it made, and we talk about this a lot, but there's a theme in a lot that I do, thinking about stories are invisible, and making that visible. Power can feel invisible at times, and making that visible. And the rule of law is another concept that feels really intangible. And so I think the first thing is helpful to understand, what does that even mean? And I think about that in terms of, you know things that we take for granted. When the light turns red, most often we stop. I mean, I feel like increasingly nowadays you see people who will just blow right through it, but generally we agree that that's a good thing to do, to abide by. If we're supposed to pay our taxes, we do. If there's, something, if we're, any number of examples where if there is a rule, we abide by it. And that's been the way that often our system is is meant to work. And I think you can see, and I've worked in many different countries where there's not that same expectation, and it can feel really daunting, where if you don't already have people who see a red light and stop, or see a stop sign and stop, and abide by the rules that make us all safer, you feel, where do you even begin to to put that in place and to have that respect spread, population wide. I think we're seeing an erosion in trust in our institutions now, and without, again, just let me add to the list of things that feel invisible but are really important. How do you can't see trust, you can't put your arms around trust, but we see the impact when we don't have that trust and when we aren't abiding by rule of law. And so I think the ideal, what I'd love to see, is have the laws be fair and just, and then have the upholding of those be fair and just. And that's not where we've always been. And it feels like that's not where we are now. It's just it is a really complicated concept, and it's one that I think about a lot more now, because while it can feel oppressive sometimes, in the long run it is something that is, if done in a fair, if we have the laws and policies and systems in place that are fair, it is better for all of us.
Okay. So, like you, I'm also a storyteller, and I believe everybody has a story to tell. But two things sometimes get in the way of that. One is some people don't quite know how to tell their stories, and then other people don't want to listen to other people's stories if it differs from their own experiences. So,
Mm,
how do we get past that so that we can just listen to each other better?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think, I mean, you answered the question a bit I mean, it's the listening, but let me take that in two parts. I think telling our own story and then listening to other stories. And I think first is recognizing not everybody realizes they do have a story to tell. I think by definition, we live our own lives and we think, well, this is normal because it's my norm. And people, may not recognize, like, your life is really interesting, even if it feels like, I'm doing my own thing. It doesn't, I've never gone to space. I've never, cured cancer. Well, every single one of us does have a story of how we got here. And that may, sometimes that may be painful, that may be a hard thing to share. We talk in storytelling about how it's, depending on who you're talking to, better to share stories of scars and not wounds. And so things that we've worked through and we can look back on from a place of feeling, safe and able to share. I think, and then there's the structure of storytelling, and that can be something that's fun to work through. How do you tell a story that's interesting? But I think it starts from, our individual stories of just recognizing, like, yeah, there is something that each and every one of us has to share. When listening to other stories, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are times that listening to someone else's experience can feel really uncomfortable. Like, they may have seen parts of the world that you haven't, or you don't, want to know about, or just really really challenging things. And so I think when listening to others, it really starts with being in a place of, openness, and listening with generosity, and listening to understand rather than trying to correct the other person, or trying to anticipate, or trying to say, oh, well, you shouldn't have done that. Really, really, I think that the short way of saying it is getting curious and seeking to understand what their experience was.
So, why are stories so important to all humans?
Oh my gosh, we've been telling stories since we knew how to talk. It's like getting around the fire, and we're wired for story. I mean, if you think about, if you've gone to a really, boring talk, odds are you don't remember much from it. But if someone tells you a story, then you are much more likely to remember And the way the story, I can get some into the story arc. You have something where there's something that catches your attention, and then there's this journey of what's going to happen next, and you get that anticipation and bated breath. I mean, you're all, as you're hearing a story. And nowadays, we don't gather around the campfire, we gather around the TV screen, or the movie screen, and but it's still that same watching of stories. And as we're watching or listening, our brains are just absolutely awash in different chemicals. And it may be dopamine, it may be adrenaline, it may, all these things that really get us, our memory going, and we pay attention. So I'd be curious, as your listeners, I'd like encourage them, think about a movie that you saw recently, or a story that you heard. I mean, those are things that are really memorable, and it's so incredibly human. I mean, stories are what sets us apart from other animals. Dogs can communicate, dolphins communicate, apes, but nobody else other than humans is telling stories.
So, what happened in your life? Can you point to a specific situation that sort of influenced your decision to work towards justice and human rights?
Mm. I think it started really young. Even with the story that I remember most is my mom cutting chocolates, teeny tiny chocolates, into four pieces. So my two brothers and we could all sample each one. And I think as small as that sounds, it's something that just stuck with me, because there was a way to share. There was a way for everybody to try a little bit of everything. And sure, I mean, like, it wouldn't have been bad parenting to say, you pick the chocolate, you get the orange, you get, just, and be done with it. But that going a little bit of an extra step, was something that really, really impacted me. I think even bigger than that, though, was going to a magnet school in Temple. And at the time, I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know about the history of racism in this country. I didn't know about segregation. I didn't know that this was a response to integrating schools. I just knew that I went from my neighborhood across town to another neighborhood that didn't look at all like mine. And even as a kid, you could see, signs and I wouldn't have known the word poverty, but that's, it was a much poorer neighborhood that where the school was. And seeing the difference, also seeing, through a child's eyes, this part of town was white and this part of town was black. And it, you know nobody told me why, but it seemed wrong. And I'd spent some time before Texas in Georgia, and there was a family, next door, but kind of up the hill from us. We were in a small house, and this was a bigger house. I think it even had a swing set in the backyard. And my friend there, it's a black family, and a daughter who was my friend. And so that, I just think that my norm in Georgia became, that was my norm as a child. And so then to move to Texas and see this difference, just it just didn't make sense to me. And I think that's always, it stuck with me ever since.
Hmm. Okay. So, why did you go from being a lawyer to working on documentaries, then on to what you do now?
I I thought when I went into law that I would litigate forever. It was a passion. I thought, this is our justice system. I will be, I'll be a litigator and make the world a more just place. And I look back on that now and realize how naive it was. I worked in cases around the world, in places like Guatemala and Colombia and Liberia, and saw really, I'm trying to think of a less nerdy way to put this than grave injustices, but that's, I saw it, just horrible conditions. And I saw, because the nature of the work I was doing, the connection to us in the United States, in like a direct connection in the sense of, where do we think our bananas come from? Does chocolate come from? Where does rubber come from? I had never thought of these things, but our tires that are on every single, car and moped and, semi out there, the rubber's got to come from somewhere. And it's quite often from latex trees. And quite often it's workers in Liberia who are they call it tapping the tree, but, cutting in a particular way to get the raw latex. All of that is collected to then be processed. All of this, like
Mm.
these connections that I just hadn't thought about. And to see how unfairly the workers were being treated, I thought, I want to do something about this. And unfortunately, the legal cases for me weren't that way. There's something where you're working on behalf of people who can't afford a lawyer. And so finding people to support these cases can be a challenge. And then you're up against big companies whose, you know, I wish I lived in a world where instead of paying big firms a lot of money to defend their claims, they would do the right thing, ideally in the first place. But that's not the world that we live in. And so after just one too many of these cases didn't get to the resolution I wanted to see, I decided this isn't the path that I can stay on. And I say that with great respect for the lawyers who are out there litigating the cases that take 20, 30 years to get to trial. I didn't get the patience gene. And so I took a big jump to film, not knowing anything about film other than having seen a lot of documentaries and thinking, this is, what an amazing way to experience other parts of the world and hear other stories in, maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 90 minutes, but or anywhere, in between. And that felt like a way where if I could tell this story, if people could see the people that I saw in Liberia, if they could hear from them, if they could hear their stories, then that could be a way to change hearts and minds in ways that lawsuits just weren't.
Okay. Your core values on your website include a repeated use of the word radical. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a big word, right? And it's one that nowadays I think it is, I guess, probably fair to say, even people tend not to use it as a compliment. Like they're too, people being, they're just too radical and too far out there. And it's interesting because the book I just read about Bonhoeffer, the title is Radical Integrity. And so thinking about, something that's really truly the essence of it. So when we talk about, radical decency, radical candor, and I want to be clear, I'm borrowing that from Kim Scott, who wrote the book about radical candor, and this notion of just getting all the other stuff out of the way and really being decent to each other, being human. And so that's where all of our 8 values come from. And it feels a little risky in this environment, honestly, Melvin. Like I feel like anytime we use the word radical, that can be heard many ways, but I'm sticking with it.
So, do you consider yourself radical?
Oh, um, I I think, I mean, I feel like I can't say no to that. And yet, if I think about it in the sense of, if you think of a radical as someone who's out, doing, I guess where I'm thinking is we use that term now. People who are radical left or radical right are the ones who are not listening, who are, if I can put it this way, kind of giving a bad name to everybody else on their side. I'm putting that in quotes for your listeners or their team. I'm definitely not that. I think I'm radically pro-human. I try to be, when we talk about decency, that's in contrast to competition. I feel like we live in this space, and I don't have anything, against football and basketball, and there's a place for that competition. But I think too often in our lives, we, day to day, there's this, I've got to be better than somebody else, and I can't be worse than somebody else. And that's just exhausting. And so if we can replace that competition and competing to win all the time with a kindness to each other, with respecting each other's humanity, that I can be radical about.
Okay, let's continue on this theme of words meaning things. So, some people consider the idea of DEI to be racist and un American, yet they aren't even willing to spell out the acronym of diversity, equity, and inclusion because I think they inherently understand that being opposed to those things might actually be racist. So, can we have a radically honest discussion in this country if some people can't even be honest about the terms they use?
Hmm. I think that there's a lot. I appreciate the question, and there's a lot in that. I think that the easier part, if any part of this is easy, is thinking about the acronym. I think that the DEI has become, you know, by using the shorthand, you're right. We're not even looking at the actual words within that. It's just become a weapon. And I think about that. I live, now I'm near DC, and it felt very personal, very close to home when there earlier this year there was the crash between the plane and the helicopter, and I flew out the next day and saw, there's still the recovery efforts. I mean, we were still,
Hmm.
and that was a generous we, like, I was definitely not among the brave rescue team there, but I mean, pulling bodies out of the Potomac River, to use DEI then as this was somehow the cause of a tragedy. Just, I felt like that we reached a low point there. So, and I think that's easier to do when you just have this term you throw around without actually thinking about the words. When we look at each of those words, I think this is something that and I think a lot in particular around equity, because I've worked in organizations that are squarely focused on promoting equity. And it's a word that's been in use for literally centuries. And it's something that's evolved alongside, you've got the common law and you've got the rule of law, where you've got, very strict by the letter of the law. Equity is meant to be more human, where we understand different circumstances. I think of Les Mis, where you have somebody who steals a loaf of bread. Well, we can agree, stealing is wrong. If you're stealing so that your children don't go hungry, maybe there's the bigger context to around that. And so that's where equity comes from. But I think even using the full word now has, because we don't have a shared definition around it, it and because not just that, I think where people are focused on, saying, well, we can have equality and opportunity, but if equity means you have to have the exact same outcome, that's then we can't get behind that. And so I think that the word is just, we don't have a shared definition, and that is meaning we cannot have a productive conversation. So to answer your question, I mean, I hope that, yes, we can have, radically honest conversations. I sure don't think they're going to be on social media. I mean, that's not encouraging a lot of deep thinking and listening there. I think it's in spaces where there's a lot of bravery, a lot of humility, coming back to the earlier question, a willingness to listen, and a willingness, honestly, to be wrong. And there may be people, shaking their fist at their, at their whatever people are listening to right now. But I think back on the simplified version of history that I learned in Texas, And I don't mean to pick on Texas. I know that this is, you know, countrywide, but the version I learned was very much, you know, United States has always been the best. We always will be the best. We were always right. If we did something slightly wrong, well, you know, we should have been right, you know. I'm not meaning to be flippant, but that's kind of the version, you know, and this very linear, you know, there were things that were wrong. We fixed them. You know, I learned about, you know, the civil rights movement as if, you know, by the 1960s, you know, everything was done. We fixed it all. And then I remember, and this I'll share a more personal story in, you know, learning, you know, we had eliminated gender discrimination and sexual harassment. Well, we have laws against that now, so that doesn't happen. So imagine my surprise, my very first, you know, job, like a real job, not at TCBY or, you know, lifeguarding, and and there was someone who was blatantly sexually harassed. She was a legal assistant, someone else was a partner, and guess what? He brought in a lot of money, so a whole lot of nothing happened. And that was a, you know, a big surprise to me as someone who had learned, you know, the history, like as if we fixed it all, and then to see actually that's not the reality. And it is much happier place to live in this bubble. And I don't mean to sound critical, but you know, a bubble of like everything is fixed, everything is great. If somebody's not living, you know, their best life, that's their fault. There's some shortcoming on their fault. It is much more complicated to see. There are, you know, the way that the world is operating just truly isn't always fair. And to be able to say where, you know, we got, in some cases folks are really lucky, and sometimes, you know, we're not. That's that notion of being born on third base and thinking that you you know, you earned your way there, and you know, are being born with two strikes. And that's not, I don't say that wanting, you know, it's not to make anybody feel guilty about that. It's not to say, you know, anything other than we need to be honest, and to say where something isn't, you know, where the world isn't fair, isn't operating like it should, well, let's fix that. But if you're being told everything's already perfect and there's nothing to fix, you know, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, quick personal story here relating to fairness. Uh, just my interaction with my own son, who's now 27 years old, and he's a mechanical engineer and lives in Virginia. He had a lot of things going for him. He was very athletic, very smart. He also had some things going against him. And one thing I always told him was anybody can be stopped by obstacles. So I don't want you to
Mm,
say something is unfair. It may be entirely unfair, but you have to figure out a way to get around it. But on the other side, somebody can't put up a barrier and then it slows you down and then them blaming you for taking longer to get to the finish line than it took them.
yeah,
So we have to acknowledge both sides of it eventually.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So as I mentioned earlier, we met at the Principles First Summit where disenfranchised Republicans and centrists meet to discuss public policy. Is your organization primarily focused on shifting political power, or can it be corporate or social power?
Our power is, when we talk about power, it is all forms of that. We focus on advocacy, and that is changing laws and policies and systems. The easiest example is, you know, people think about going to Congress and advocating for a particular issue. That's an easy example, but there's policy everywhere, you know, at the neighborhood level. What time does the park open and close? You know, what's the bus route that gets kids to school? What is, how does the hospital operate? I mean, policies, when it's yet another, I'll add to the long list of things that are invisible, but once you make them visible, you see it everywhere. It's everywhere. So when we're advocating for change, when we're wanting to see a shift in power, that's everywhere, local, you know, community, state, national, and even global.
All right, this question might be a little bit tough, but I want you to think about it.
Okay,
Can our country
sounds good.
survive if justice for some, rather than justice for all, is an acceptable outcome for many at the top of our federal government?
The short answer is it can survive, but in what form? And I say that because there's a lot of countries in the world that are surviving where there's definitely not justice for all. It's just for some, and there's a lot of suffering. I think the version of our country that all of us, and I do mean all of us, thinking at the folks who attended Principles First, the folks who are concerned about where we are right now, that's not the version we want to see. And I'm pausing so long there because I think that there's a real misconception about the us versus them. And there's a lot of division among the 99.9% of us who are not in high positions of power, who are not incredibly wealthy beyond imagination. But what really serves the them up at those levels is for the us down here to be divided. And that there's a long history of that. And so as long as we are seeing an us versus them, a red versus blue, playing this teams, any way that we want to divide ourselves, including along political lines, we're not going to get anywhere. The image that I get, and folks in Texas and football fans will appreciate this, we're so focused on our team winning that we're not seeing that the ground beneath us crumbling, and that's an issue for all of us. And so that's what gave me so much hope at Principles First. It felt like a lot of folks who were recognizing there's a problem with the foundation of this house that we all share. And so let's put aside some of the differences we've got about how people live in all the different rooms and fix this foundation so that we'll have the luxury of going back and using our First Amendment rights and our ability to, to disagree on some of the details. Right now, it feels like there's something much more fundamental that we're needing to address.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions left. So, what is your ultimate goal as an organization, whether it be politics or not?
Yeah, well, and we're not. I would say we're not. We're cross political. We're cross partisan is the word I meant to use there. Not even bipartisan. We're not nonpartisan. It is all you know all are welcome, because we want everybody to recognize the power of their own voice, to be effective and empathetic and trusted in their advocacy. And that can be at every single level, but we want folks to be, when you're calling for change, how can you do that in an effective way?
Okay, so final question today: how can listeners support your organization?
There are several ways. They can join us on our monthly webinars. They can join us in a upcoming storytelling 101 course, an ethical storytelling, a learning community. I will share, and this is going to be the first time I share this publicly. So, and this is
Breaking
this
breaking
is
news! Breaking
a
news here.
yes, breaking news. So there are a lot of similarities between the United States and Brazil. We're the two, biggest democracies with with a lot of shared history, but also a lot of differences, a lot of space to learn from each other. And right now I am working on a learning community to have people really absorb some of those lessons, to understand, what it is that we can learn from Brazil. And I'll just be even more specific. Our January 6th, there are a lot of parallels to January 8th that took place in Brazil 2 years and 2 days later.
Mm.
And yet their response has been incredibly different. And so I'm working with other facilitators and other pro-democracy advocates to put together a learning community that would include time in Rio to learn directly from people who are impacted and who have been working on the democracy movement there in Brazil. And so if that's something that's at all intriguing, I would love to hear from folks. It is something that would be it's not free. And so if anybody is interested in being part of that or funding that, making that happen, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Our guest today has been advocacy communications professional Piper Hendricks. Piper, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Melvin, and for all the stories you're sharing out into the world.
Thank you. Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including links for Piper's organization and the things that she's doing out in Brazil and across the world, all the good news that she's sharing. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.